spoke about kinds, Bodhi,
Mhm.
and skeptics or critics of young earth creation, they'll typically challenge us and say, okay, in light of kinds or separate ancestry, how can we determine what is and what isn't related? Where's this boundary in kinds? Is it that all dogs are unrelated to, let's say, cats or felids, but then what do we do with a creature like hyenas? Bears, are they related to creatures like dogs and cats? Where do we draw this line, Bodhi? What would be a good way to engage that challenge?
Right. Well, first off, from a layman's perspective, we oftentimes, give that little rule of thumb. If creatures can interbreed with each other and hybridize offspring, then that's usually a good sign that they're part of the same kind. Just to give you an example, cats. 20 years ago, we were struggling. Was there two different cat kinds? Was there a big cat kind? Was there a small cat kind?
Right.
And then what we had was an instance where, something like a bobcat or something interbred with the bigger cats, and then the bobcat interbred with the smaller cats. And that let us know, hey, they're all part of one kind. So, when it comes to creatures alive today, that's actually pretty easy to be able to say, hey, where's those boundaries, where are those boundaries at? And, that's cat kind, dog kind, those are easy, and they're good ones. They're familiar, that people are familiar with. When it comes to elephant kinds and stuff like that, you got mammoths and mastodons that are part of that same kind. And we can look at their cognitum level, their bone structure, and so forth. It's so similar to Asian elephants and African elephants and Nepalese elephants and so forth. But at the same time, those are extinct. Now, like I said, it gets tough. It gets really tough when it comes to extinct creatures, because we're literally looking at bone structures going, are these similar enough? Could these be variations, within that same kind? And, there is a little leeway in that. Now, just so people know, there's an entire field called baraminology. Bara is the Hebrew word for created. So it's the created kind is really what that is. Min means a kind. So it's that Hebrew baramin is that created kind. So there's a whole field of baraminology. I've worked with some experts on some of that, particularly when back in the days when we were doing all that research for the Ark Encounter. There was a number of different people that we worked with, because not one person is an expert on, say, the amphibians or the reptiles or the mammals, and there's a lot of these animals that have made it all the way around the world. Hey, does this animal in Africa breed with this animal over here in Alaska? Those are the kinds of questions that we were asking, and sometimes we didn't have some of that data, so you had to kind of do a little bit of guesswork. And of course, when it comes to the extinct creatures, sometimes you've had extinct variations of certain creatures that are gone, and you can't see if they're interbreeding back with each other. But yeah, there's a whole field of study on that. And, I want to encourage people to check out some of that research. I probably can't answer all that in just, 5 minutes, but there is a lot of researchers that are working on all that. And I want to encourage them in that. Actually, that's a big field of study right now.
Well, it's a great point. And I like that you point to the morphology or anatomy found in fossil species. It becomes difficult even for the evolutionists, because so many times there's been instances. One that comes to mind has to do with the research of Jack Horner, where he suggested that some dinosaurs previously classified as separate species, Bodhi, actually turned out to be different growth stages of the same dinosaur species. So at first we had different species, and so several different species, but no, we realized this is the same species, but in different stages of its life. Right. And so fossils, bones found in the dirt, really are low quality, low confidence science. With creatures, extant creatures, reproduction is a great first approximation. And we have genetic data for extant creatures. And I like looking to genetic level discontinuities. One big one that they've established in 2024, even further, is the Y chromosomes, Bodhi, between humans and chimpanzees. They've got sophisticated Y chromosome sequencing data now. And when you compare overall gene content, size differences, and architecture, the human Y and the chimpanzee Y, which evolutionists say our closest cousin is the chimpanzee, we can supposedly go back to a common ancestor 6 million years ago, they're less than 30% the same. And so I like to argue these kind of discontinuities help us to draw a line of in ancestry and separate kinds, where you've got humans in their own kind And of course, based on these massive differences, chimpanzees in a separate kind as well.
Yeah, I think that's amazing research. I love that nowadays, we've got genetic research. You go back 100 years ago, people didn't have much of that. I mean, that was in its infancy. You go back 500 years ago, people are like, what was that? They can usually, but what I think is fascinating is, people 2,000 years ago could tell the difference between different kinds. And, so it has a lot to do, I think, with the cognitum level. I mean, yeah, we can get some breeding. I mean, you go out there and you see a Chihuahua and you see a Great Dane and you think those are part of the same kind. um, and they are. And that's what's fascinating about it. So you can see some great diversity in things, but sometimes you would never get natural breeding with that. And it's like that
Mm.
even with a lot of wild animals. Some are bigger, some are smaller. Sometimes one animal comes in heat at a different time than another that are even part of the same kind. And as a result of that, you don't see interbreeding, even though they may be living at lines very similar to one another. Sometimes we do see these things hybridize. And I think that shocks zoos when they put creatures together. Oh, these get along good. Let's put them in there together. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, they had a baby. That's where that liger came from. Just so we see those types of situations. It is a fascinating area of research. I know out in the secular world, when it comes to extinct creatures, they struggle with this as well. Um, the way they classify different things. Of course, they do clades nowadays, but back in the older days, they would still separate things. Genus, species, family. A little bit different than what they do today. But there could be times where, on the same continent, they find, say, a sauropod dinosaur grouping down here, some up here millions and millions of years later by their viewpoint. And so they have this as a family and they have this as a family. And so they separate those out and you have two different families. Yet at the same
Mm.
time, they're probably part of the same family. When we look
Right.
at it as biblical creationists, they're all right there. They're just buried in different layers in the flood. But see, you can see how they sometimes would separate out different families where we would put those families together because, once again, we're looking at it from two different worldviews. So there's those little connections as well.
Well, you hinted at it there, and it's a great point that we find a great deal of morphological variation within species of the same kind that even evolutionists would agree with us on. For example, in your domestic dog, you have an incredible amount of variation there. And so that means sometimes there exists more variation within the same species than across species. We see that today, and we can see reproduction. We can do these breeding tests. We have genetics. Well, how do we determine that then in the fossil record? So if you have fossil species with no genetics, no way to see if these creatures could produce viable offspring or offspring in general. So how can you determine or differentiate between things like homology or homoplasy or convergent evolution? So evolutionists have these major struggles.
Yeah, I tell you what, that's a great question. I mean, creationists and evolutionists, when it comes to extinct creatures, there's certain things that none of us can seem to get over because we just don't have all the data we wish we could have. I think that would help us out if we did have a few live creatures of those. But that's what happens when it comes to dinosaurs. Sometimes you just have to look at a cognitum level, look at their morphology, and say, hey, yeah, these are close enough. They're similar.
Mhm.
But even then, when it comes to some of that stuff, we also have to take some of those with a grain of salt and be careful because once we start diving into those kinds of things, we're diving into science models.
Right.
And I love science models. Sometimes they can really help explain a lot of things, but at the same time, I want to stand on the authority of the Bible. Science models can change. We see those change all the time, whether they're creationist models, whether they're evolutionary models. So you got to be careful of just holding on to a model and saying, "Yeah, this is the truth. This is what we got. You better interpret it in light of this one." Sometimes we just got to be careful and don't hold on to those like they're the gospel truth. The gospel truth is the gospel truth.
Amen, brother. So important. I'm curious, Bodhi, how do we understand? And there's been some discussion of this in the live chat here. We've had a great live chat the entire time, a lot of good interaction.
Good.
How do we understand on the ark? God sends two of every kind, but how do we understand the difference between clean and unclean? Is God bringing two of every kind, but seven of some or 14 of others? How do we understand that?
Okay, well, the Bible talks later, and then this is Moses as well, because he puts the account down. He explains what clean creatures were. We see that in Leviticus 11. We also see it in Deuteronomy, kind of repeated. So we have an idea of what the clean creatures were. So basically just default 2 of each kind, 7 of some. I know some people want to argue 14 of some, but there's some different little intricacies in there. I tend to lean towards 7, for some good reasons. It's not worth getting into for here. But nevertheless, you bring 7 of those clean. And so even though, we just see a passing comment of 7 there in Genesis, later on, since Leviticus and Deuteronomy talk about clean creatures, we can know what those really were. So when it comes to, say, the sheep, goat kind, boom, they'd have 7 of those. Cattle, 7 of those. So yeah, we're going to get some of that. One thing that I found interesting too is, the animals went on the ark, a male and its mate, and of course it'd be like that, with the possibility of a male and its mate, for that 7. Of course, one was sacrificed after the flood. Was there one that was a sacrificial animal as possible, left that way? But when they were called off of the ark, a lot of people may not realize when God called them off the ark, he called them off by their families. So there probably were some animals breeding on the ark. I know some people said, oh, well, maybe they were hibernating. Some animals might have. Elephants likely did not go through a full gestation time. They might have been pregnant coming off the ark. But, rabbits may have come off by the hundreds, if you know anything about rabbits. But, yeah, they were called off by their families. So there probably was some breeding for some of the animals while they were on the ark.
And I appreciate that answer. It's very helpful. And if I remember correctly from your presentation, because we also have questions on this, then from the creationist perspective, Bodhi, that time period after the flood, we have an ice age, most creationists would hold to. And the reason why we don't really have dinosaurs today, but they would have been taken onto the ark, were due to many reasons. Environment, I think you said, was one of them. Environmental change. Humans killed off a lot of dinosaurs. I mean, who wants to live next door to a T-Rex? and perhaps that's where a lot of these legends could, yeah, exactly. That would be kind of cool, actually. and perhaps that's where a lot of these legends come into play. These knights in shining armor defeating the dragon. Perhaps that was an embellishment of a situation after the flood where man was killing T-Rex.